"That's not Mommy. You, Mommy." He said, "That's funny, lady." And I thought, well, I hope that's a review.
They seemed like the perfect on-screen couple, full of charm, chemistry, and laughter. But behind the scenes of Bewitched, something far more painful was playing out. Dick York vanished from the show without warning, and Elizabeth Montgomery never spoke his name again. For decades, fans were left wondering what truly happened. Why did she refuse to ever work with him again? What drove such a deep, permanent rift? After all these years, the real story has finally surfaced, and it is more heartbreaking than anyone expected. When Bewitched first hit television screens in 1964, it felt like something entirely new. The idea of a beautiful suburban witch hiding her powers to please her mortal husband was already charming. But what truly made the show soar was the chemistry between its two leads, Elizabeth Montgomery and Dick York. Elizabeth Montgomery was already a rising star in Hollywood. The daughter of film legend Robert Montgomery, she had made a name for herself by playing sophisticated, smart, and slightly mysterious women. When she signed on to play Samantha Stevens, she brought a grounded elegance to the role that audiences instantly loved. Dick York, on the other hand, was a respected character actor who had paid his dues on stage, in radio, and in dozens of television dramas. He was quick-witted, deeply charismatic, and possessed a subtle comic timing that made his portrayal of Darren Stevens so memorable. York had a warmth to him, the kind of everyman charm that made him instantly relatable, even when reacting to Samantha's outrageous magical mishaps. Behind the scenes, the early days of Bewitched were light-hearted and full of promise. York and Montgomery clicked immediately. They were not romantically involved. Montgomery was married to producer William Asher, but their banter on set was real. Co-stars recalled them laughing together between takes and bouncing off each other with ease. They had an unspoken rhythm, and it showed on screen. In those first few seasons, Bewitched was a massive success. It consistently ranked near the top of the ratings, and critics praised both Montgomery and York for their performances. Darren's exasperated reactions, Samantha's gentle wit, it all seemed effortless. But that kind of on-screen magic rarely lasts forever. Even as the cameras captured playful, light-hearted episodes, things behind the scenes slowly began to shift. There was something happening beneath the surface, a subtle tension that only a few people noticed at first. Dick York's smile never faded on screen, but the truth was that something much heavier had begun to weigh him down. And Elizabeth Montgomery, despite her warmth in public, was not someone who tolerated weakness easily. Long before he ever set foot on the set of Bewitched, Dick York was already battling a ghost, one that haunted his every movement. In 1959, during the filming of the Western drama They Came to Cordura, a single moment changed the course of his life. In a physically demanding scene, York and several others were operating a handcar, the kind used to push rail lines manually. When one of the crew members lost their grip, the heavy metal handle snapped back violently, slamming into York's spine with brutal force. He later described it as an explosion inside my back. The damage was immediate, a torn muscle along his spine, and the consequences were lifelong. Rather than seek long-term treatment or take time off, York pushed through. In those days, chronic pain was something actors were expected to grit their teeth through. He entered a cycle of painkillers, chiropractic treatments, and sheer willpower. When he was cast in Bewitched several years later, he was already living in a delicate balance, constantly managing his pain in silence. But the demands of a hit television show would soon make that balancing act nearly impossible. In the beginning, few noticed. York had an extraordinary ability to appear cheerful and quick-witted, even when his back was screaming in agony. He would film his scenes with energy and humor, only to collapse into a chair between takes, drenched in sweat. Stagehands began keeping folding cots nearby so he could lie down between scenes. Scripts were rewritten to minimize his physical movement. Directors angled the camera carefully to hide the fact that York was often bracing himself against furniture for support. The production team, led by Montgomery's husband William Asher, tried to accommodate him at first. They shuffled the shooting schedule, offered him time to rest, and encouraged him to take whatever help he needed. But television moves fast, and the luxury of patience wears thin under pressure. York's missed days began to pile up. Sometimes he was simply too sick to come in. Other times, he arrived but could not make it through a full scene. Through it all, York never lost his warmth. He remained kind to everyone on set and avoided complaining, even when the pain became unbearable. But his struggle began to wear on others, especially Elizabeth Montgomery. At first, she sympathized, but by season 4, her tone reportedly changed. According to multiple accounts from crew members, she began keeping her distance from York. The once playful energy between them turned cool. Some say she was frustrated by the constant schedule changes. Others believe she felt York's condition was drawing too much attention away from the rest of the cast. Whatever the reason, her patience seemed to be running out. And as York's body gave out more and more often, the atmosphere on set turned increasingly cold. But even that was just the beginning of what would become one of classic television's most heartbreaking divides. By the 4th season of Bewitched, the cracks behind the scenes had started to deepen. What began as a supportive work environment had become strained. And for Dick York, every day on set was now a physical and emotional battle. The pressure to perform, the relentless shooting schedule, and his deteriorating health all collided, creating an undercurrent of frustration that no amount of movie magic could hide. Elizabeth Montgomery, once warm and engaged with York, had become noticeably distant. She had always been known for her professionalism, focused, driven, and determined to keep the show running smoothly. But sources close to the production said that her tone shifted. Instead of greeting York with a smile or a joke between takes, she often kept to herself. Some speculated that it was her way of coping, detaching emotionally to protect herself from the daily chaos that had begun to define the Bewitched set. Others were less generous. Rumors swirled that Montgomery had grown irritated with York's absences and on-set struggles. Some claimed she felt held back by the constant rewrites and reshoots. And then there was the influence of William Asher, her husband, and the show's executive producer. Known for his no-nonsense attitude, Asher reportedly clashed with York on multiple occasions. He was focused on keeping the show tight, efficient, and profitable. And York's unpredictable health was beginning to interfere with that goal. One former crew member recalled an instance where York, visibly exhausted and wincing in pain, asked for a short break before filming a complicated scene. Asher allegedly rolled his eyes and walked off set. Moments like that sent a clear message. The clock was ticking on York's time with the show. Montgomery never made any public complaints, but her silence spoke volumes. There were fewer personal interactions, no signs of the camaraderie that once defined the early days. They shared scenes on camera, but off camera, their connection had cooled. Even when York delivered heartfelt performances, often pushing through agonizing pain to do so, there was a tension in the air. Some days, it was so thick, you could feel it between takes. Despite everything, York continued to show up, often against doctors' orders. He genuinely loved the role and believed in the show. But he was no longer the easygoing, spirited co-star from season 1. The pain had changed him. The strain showed in his face, in the way he moved, and in how rarely he now smiled off-screen. And Elizabeth, under the dual weight of a high-pressure production and a demanding marriage to the show's boss, was no longer the same either. Their once genuine connection had withered into something cold, professional, and guarded. And then came the moment when that growing distance turned into something irreversible. The moment that changed everything came during the filming of season 5. Dick York had been hanging on by a thread for months, dragging himself to the set, even when he could barely walk. On one particular day in 1969, his body finally gave out. In front of the entire cast and crew, they were filming a simple scene, nothing out of the ordinary. York was standing in the kitchen set, delivering lines as Darren Stevens, when suddenly he turned pale and started swaying. Without warning, he dropped to the floor. The crew rushed in. Production stopped. For a moment, the studio went completely silent. He was rushed to the hospital, and that was it. He never returned to the set of Bewitched again. Official statements were vague. The studio cited health concerns, but the real story was more complicated. According to York himself, he wanted to come back. He said later that he begged the producers for a few weeks off to recover and promised he could finish the season. But that call never came. Instead, just days later, the studio announced that Dick Sargent would be stepping in to play Darren Stevens, a jarringly different version of the character, and one that many fans never fully accepted. There was no on-screen explanation for the change, no farewell episode. York simply disappeared from the series as if he had never existed, and what hurt even more than the sudden replacement was the silence. Elizabeth Montgomery never reached out. No visit, no letter, no message. After 5 years of working side by side, their partnership ended without a word. Some believed it was William Asher's decision to replace York, a clean break that would allow the show to move forward. But others saw something deeper in Montgomery's silence. Was it frustration? Guilt? Indifference? To this day, no one knows for sure. She never publicly acknowledged York's departure, not even once. For Dick York, the sudden rejection was devastating. He had given everything he had to the role, often at great personal cost, and in the end, it was not enough to earn a goodbye. Behind closed doors, there was plenty of talk. Some cast members privately expressed sympathy for York. Others quietly admitted they were relieved to have someone more physically dependable in the role. But whatever their thoughts, the message was clear. York was gone, and nobody was supposed to talk about it. For the fans, the switch was jarring. But for York, it was a personal heartbreak. He had been pushed out of the role he loved, left behind by the people he once called colleagues, and cut off from a co-star he had deeply respected, maybe even loved. And that silence from Elizabeth Montgomery would only grow more painful in the years to come. After Dick York's sudden departure from Bewitched, there was a deafening silence, not just from the press or the producers, but from Elizabeth Montgomery herself. What had once been a lively, if complicated, working relationship ended without closure. York later said that he never received a phone call, never heard a kind word, and never got so much as a note from her. And the silence was not temporary. It lasted the rest of their lives. At first, York tried to stay optimistic. In interviews years later, he still spoke of Montgomery with respect and admiration. He described her as talented, charming, and professional. He never criticized her publicly. Even when asked about how their relationship ended, he chose his words carefully. "She went her way, and I went mine," he once said. But behind those words was a deep sadness that never quite faded. Privately, it was a different story. York confided in close friends that he had tried reaching out. He sent a letter, maybe more than one, hoping to clear the air. He never heard back. According to those closest to him, the lack of response cut deeper than anything else. For all the hours they had spent together on set, for all the laughter and banter in the early seasons, it seemed there was no interest on her part in making peace. The reasons behind Montgomery's silence remain unclear even now. Some speculate it was out of loyalty to her then-husband William Asher, who had reportedly grown tired of accommodating York's health issues. Others believe she may have resented the disruption York's condition brought to the show's momentum, that perhaps, in her mind, he had become more trouble than he was worth. Still others wonder if the issue was more personal. There were rumors, never confirmed, that York had developed real feelings for Montgomery during the early years of filming. Some suggested that his affection for her may have gone beyond friendship, while she, married and focused on her own path, did not reciprocate. If there was an emotional disconnect, it could explain her desire to create distance once he was no longer part of the production. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. York never worked with her again, never spoke to her again, and never received any acknowledgement of his departure or his pain. And yet, remarkably, he never expressed bitterness. Until the end of his life, he continued to speak of Montgomery with dignity. But Elizabeth's silence, even decades later, seemed to speak louder than any words. And while York quietly faded from the spotlight, the story of what really happened between them grew more complicated with every passing year. After Bewitched, Dick York never landed another role of that scale. Hollywood had a way of forgetting actors who could no longer keep pace, especially those dealing with long-term health issues. For York, the injury that had haunted him for years only got worse. And without steady work or a major support system, his life took a heartbreaking turn. By the mid-1970s, he was all but retired from acting. The physical pain had become too great, and the offers had stopped coming. He lived in relative obscurity with his wife, Joan, whom he had married back in 1952. Through every struggle, she remained by his side, sometimes literally carrying him when he was unable to walk. Their bond became his anchor in a world that no longer had a place for him. The financial strain hit hard. At one point, York and his wife were living on the edge of poverty, relying on minimal residuals and disability support. There were times when they had to choose between medical care and groceries. He described those years as humbling, but he never expressed resentment. Not toward Hollywood, not toward Bewitched, and certainly not toward Elizabeth Montgomery. In fact, despite the silence between them, York still referred to her with kindness. In one of his final interviews, he described Montgomery as a lovely woman and said he hoped she remembered him fondly. He never once retaliated or tried to tarnish her image, even when asked directly about their estrangement. But Dick York's legacy took a remarkable turn in the final chapter of his life. Though confined to his bed for much of the 1980s and early 1990s, he used the little energy he had to make a difference. He founded Acting for Life, a charity organization dedicated to helping the homeless. From his small home in Michigan, he made phone calls, coordinated donations, and inspired others to join the cause. It was a mission that gave him purpose, and it kept his spirit alive, even as his body continued to decline. Friends say that even in his weakest moments, he remained warm, optimistic, and full of compassion. His voice, still recognizable to fans of Bewitched, had grown softer, but no less sincere. He never gave up hope that someday the rift between him and Montgomery might heal, that maybe, just maybe, they could reconnect before it was too late. But time ran out. On February 20th, 1992, Dick York passed away from complications related to emphysema. He was 63 years old. He died in his wife's arms, far from the bright lights of Hollywood, far from the fame he once knew, and still estranged from the woman who had shared his most iconic role. But if he carried any bitterness in those final days, he never showed it. And while York left quietly, Elizabeth Montgomery's silence lingered, one that would remain until her own life came to a sudden and unexpected end. Elizabeth Montgomery's career continued to flourish after Dick York's departure, but something about her demeanor changed. She remained a household name, still enchanting on screen, yet when it came to the topic of Bewitched, she grew increasingly guarded. For years, she gave interviews about her time on the show, but she never once mentioned York by name. Not in passing, not in reflection, not even when directly prompted. To outsiders, it seemed like a deliberate omission. And for those who knew how close York had once been to the heart of the series, her silence was puzzling. What could have driven such a lasting distance between two actors who had once shared so much screen time, laughter, and trust? Some believed her refusal to speak about York was rooted in guilt, that maybe she regretted how abruptly he had been replaced, or how little was done to support him as his health declined. Others were certain it came from resentment, that she blamed him for the disruption on set, for missed shoot days, or for compromising the show's production flow. Still others thought it was something far more personal, something that never made it into the tabloids or behind-the-scenes specials. There were whispers from insiders that Montgomery felt conflicted, that she had admired York but did not know how to handle his pain, that she had tried, at first, to be patient and compassionate. But the mounting stress from her own personal life, especially her complex marriage to William Asher, made her detach as a form of self-preservation. After all, Asher was not just her husband, he was her boss. His frustrations with York may have influenced her more than anyone realized. There is also the possibility that Montgomery simply preferred to avoid revisiting the most difficult parts of her career. She was notoriously private, particularly in her later years. She rarely spoke about conflict, choosing instead to focus on her charitable work, family, and the legacy of the series as a whole. But even so, her absolute silence on York remained a mystery. When Montgomery herself became ill in the mid-1990s, many wondered if she would finally break that silence, perhaps offer some reflection or a tribute to the man who had helped launch the magic of Bewitched alongside her, but she never did. On May 18, 1995, Elizabeth Montgomery passed away from colon cancer. She was only 62 years old. In her final interviews, there was no mention of Dick York, no reconciliation, No final words, just the same measured silence that had followed her since his exit from the show. It was the kind of silence that invites questions and leaves answers buried forever.